So I hope you have your expectations set low, because I had about 2 days to put this thing together. So it was fun. Yeah. The email came around and it said, hey, I was thinking about Marty or Karen Grand to maybe do this, and Karen wrote back within a few seconds, I think Marty would be awesome. So thank you. Love ya. I like this quote. This quote ties into my the end of the talk. Man never steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river, and he's not the same man or person. I'm sure if Heraclitus lived today, he would have said person instead. I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple different things. A little bit how river restoration has changed over time, but a lot about why we do it and what the motivators for it are. I was trying to think of something kind of keynote-y. You know, usually my talks are technical, and that's easier for me. So I struggle with a few big picture things. I called a bunch of people to try and get their opinions on what I should talk about. But the talk is partly a copy of what I gave to the Iowa Legislative Committee about 1.5 years ago or so. So if you were at that meeting, I apologize to you. If you're a friend of mine or people I know that have seen some of my talks, I apologize to you as well. I expect questions from you to be questions that I can answer. So, Will Cock is not here though, so I think we're safe. This is a picture of a project that was designed by a friend of mine and colleague, Janet Corsell, who passed away last week from cancer. And she was one of the best kinds of river restoration people you could find. She was a combo biologist, engineer, and she did a lot of awesome projects out of our Hood River office. So just want to kind of give her a nod. And if you're, you know, we need somebody to step up and take her place, so maybe that's you. So hopefully you'll get inspired tonight and want to do stuff, if you're not already. So, talked about that already. Let's just get on with it. So why do we want to do river restoration, or why do it? I think it's important, and the reason I started with that in the legislative meeting was because I knew that they were concerned about spending money, and they wanted to hear some good reasons for doing river restoration. So I think to talk about that, you really need to examine what we have done to rivers. I think we have violated them in so many ways, it's kind of hard to explain, but you all know that. I think everybody in this room understands what the impacts are. These are, in red, are the impacted stream miles. This, I don't think, includes ephemeral streams. And certainly if you've ever seen a drain tile map of Iowa or Minnesota, you know, you get the picture. So, you know, roughly half of the streams in Minnesota have been altered in some way, shape, or form. And that's not just streams, we're talking about where they originate too, wetlands, etc. Here in Iowa, we're talking about a loss of 89% of our wetlands. Let me turn my timer on here. So, what have we done? Well, we've ditched them, we've dammed them, we've built on them, we've filled in their floodplains. We farm in the watersheds, we cut down the trees, changed the landscape in many ways. We've hard armored a lot of stuff. We've cleared a lot of wood out of streams, dredged them, etc. I think a few years ago, the amount of impervious cover in this country exceeded the size of the state of Ohio. So if you can imagine a big concrete parking lot the size of Ohio, that's what we've done to our country. So these courses of action then have resulted in a lot of bad stuff, and I think, again, we all know what these are. Erosion, chemical pollution, nutrient pollution, and these end up driving a lot of what we do. an extinction rate of aquatic species 5 times that of terrestrial vertebrates. A third of our rivers listed as impaired or polluted, and frankly, probably 2/3 or 3/4 of them should be. Withdrawals that let rivers run dry, regulated rivers, etc., and increased flooding, which has been a big deal lately. I went to North Dakota State, and I never filled one sandbag when I was there. It was in the 80s, and it was dry as a bone. The Red River was usually really low, if not almost dry, and I really felt for those people that decided to go to school there after I left, because they've been doing nothing but filling sandbags ever since then. So, you know, big picture, Leonardo da Vinci, if you ever get a chance to read some of his notebook stuff, his notes, they're pretty fascinating. He actually has quite a bit about rivers and water. I can forward it to you if you want a copy, just email me. But he had a pretty good grasp on things like bank erosion and hydraulics. He was off a little bit, as you can imagine, but he looked at the world. He knew about the water cycle. He didn't really get where the water came from. He thought it came from underground originally. Didn't get the whole cycling thing, but he knew that, and he often referred to water as rivers as the corpuscles, and the tributaries as the arteries and veins of our planet. And I really believe that that's true. The rivers transport whatever we put into them. I think the great thing about rivers is, though, they have been a resource that we have mined extensively in the past, but it's one of the only kind of mined resources that we can actually restore fully. So it's great. One of the reasons we do river restoration is because natural systems, I think a lot of people ask the question, well, why don't we just buy land and let these rivers restore themselves? And I'm all for it. And frankly, if somebody came up and we had an emperor in this country and he said, we're going to spend $100 billion a year on river restoration and 99% of it's going to be buying land, I'd be all for it. I think that's where we need to start. But passive restoration works in a lot of places. Like, let's say you're in a fairly steep channel, you're taking out a dam that's got sand behind it, maybe you're exposing a cobble bed underneath there. That sand's going to mobilize pretty soon, and next thing you know, you've got a restored stream. You don't need to do a whole lot. But in the Midwest, where we have a lot of low gradient streams that don't have a lot of energy, you can have a ditch like this and set the land aside, and nothing will happen for hundreds and hundreds or thousands of years. This ditch was dug in the 1700s, and it shows no appreciable change in that time. It just doesn't have the energy to erode those banks. Whittlesea Creek on the left is an example of a stream that up in the Bayfield Peninsula area, like so many streams in this country, that were splash dammed, and so they cut all the trees down and ran them down the stream in a big, it just bulldozed these streams flat. And they've had a hard time kind of recapturing their original morphology, mainly because we don't have the same wood input. So if you cut down all the trees, it takes 300 years to grow a great big white pine and have it fall in, or even longer. And so I'll talk about wood tomorrow in some detail, but that's another example of how we can speed things up. We can actually jumpstart those processes. It's important to recognize that what healthy versus degraded rivers tell us. Trout folks use the canary in the coal mine reference all the time, and it's a good one. It's a mirror into the way we manage our natural world, I think. So how much is a river worth is a hard question to answer. If you look at this graph, from the federal government, the Delaware Estuary Watershed is worth about something around $10 billion if you were to divide it all up into its component parts. I can't tell you exactly how those numbers were calculated, but look at Wisconsin, for instance, tourism is the third largest industry behind, ironically, agriculture and timber, which impacted the most. And tourism is associated directly, of course, with rivers and lakes. In Wisconsin, we have some lakes in the north, but a lot of impoundments also. Wisconsin has the second highest number of out-of-state angler days behind Florida. I was kind of astonished that they beat Minnesota on that, but the economic value of rivers is pretty obvious when you think about the loss of soil and nutrients. You know, we had a big push back in the Dust Bowl to try and keep those things in place, and we're doing that to some degree, but we're still losing a lot. And flooding, of course, is obviously expensive. So the river restoration can cure some of these ills, keeping the water, keeping the soil and the nutrients on the landscape for a longer time. I don't think this is news to anybody, but so when you take a dam out too, values change. Riverfront property is worth something. A lot of people think that their impoundments are worth more, but in reality, the study by UW and the River Alliance of Wisconsin showed that former impoundments that had been drained and like this one here in West Bend, developed into parkland, etc., can be worth more than the impoundment frontage. There may be a watershed moment here. You know, this kind of talk is rife with puns. I can really bring it on if you want, but it's hard not to, you know. But I'll try and keep it under control. So, you know, Des Moines, the city of Des Moines gets its water from, as I'm sure many of you know in this room, Des Moines River and the Raccoon River, and so now they're thinking about suing some counties for nitrate pollution, and this could be a big deal. So it'd be interesting to see how this plays out. Massachusetts has a pretty well-organized river restoration program. It's really focused around dams at the moment, but they did a study and looked at how much money, or where that money was going in terms of job creation, and it's about 12.5 full-time jobs per $1 million spent, compared to road construction in the same state, and 8 for military spending, 8 jobs. So, and then a similar study by University of Oregon, I think it was, looked at even higher numbers, 15 to 24 total jobs per $1 million spent, and a lot of that money stuck around locally. NOAA, who funds a lot of restoration projects, looked at their coastal habitat restoration projects, which would include dam removal and river restoration as well, and found job creation numbers, you know, in the high 20s to 32 even. Again, comparing that to some of the other stuff that's out there. You know, our cities used rivers for transportation and other things, and stadiums, riverfront stadiums, etc. But apart from that, you know, they weren't real big on waterfronts as an amenity, a natural amenity. It was all about moving goods and services back and forth. But that usefulness has gone by the wayside now, and so a lot of communities like Minneapolis and Milwaukee, Austin, you know, lots of different places are looking to turn that around, and I think that it's getting away from now more of the landscape architecture hardscape to incorporate more flood control and flood storage and also natural shorelines. We just won a project in North Adams, Massachusetts as a prime on a waterfront project, which I was astonished by. Everyone else was in a landscape architecture firm, and so that there's hope out there. I think people are getting the message. So how much do we spend on river restoration? Well, I want to drop back and talk about the climate for a second, because one of the questions I wrestled with was, what's the point of doing any of this work if we're all going to go to hell in a handbasket in 100 years? And if you remember a guy by the name of Bjorn Lomborg wrote a book called The Skeptical Environmentalists back in the 90s, and I was really angry with this guy because he was ripping on climate change big time, and it was called global warming appropriately back then. And he bothered me, partly because some of his arguments were, I thought, compelling, but a lot of it was bullshit. And I think a lot of people thought the same thing. But he recently has done a complete 180 and has said that this is an alarming problem, and after 20 years of data analysis came to a different conclusion. But he said that if you look at some of the efforts in the past, like the World War II, for instance, we can marshal ourselves if we need to tackle big problems. And he estimates that with just 2% of the gross national product of the major industrial countries, we can tackle this problem. Now, if you look at this astonishing graph, I think, where we're spending $600 billion a year on military spending, imagine if half of that was for trying to figure out the climate problem. I think we could probably figure it out if it wasn't government spending. Maybe if it was part government spending and part something else. But no offense to you government folks out there. But certain efficiencies at play. So let's get rid of that one though, because when we talk, river restoration is not even showing up over here on the right. So let's get rid of that one and tilt the graph so we can see it, that it's there, but it's still quite small. This is the average annual expenditure on river restoration per state in the United States, give or take. We spend a lot on iPods and iPads and whatever else, and then quite a bit on fast food, but not so much on other stuff. Let's take some of these other ones out and just go with the Major League Baseball salary budget and Clayton Kershaw, who plays for the LA Dodgers, and then average state. Well, now we've got a little bit of elevation. We've come up just a little bit. It's encouraging. So, well, these weren't working to try and get the point across, so I added a couple more in there. There's Clayton Kershaw. You know, graph scales can make you, everything's relative, right? So I look at this as my hockey dues aren't so bad. Only got one kid in the program, so it's not bad. All right, I should have gone into baseball, I guess, is the lesson there. But so now we're up there. We can show something. So if anybody gives you a hard time or writes an article that we're spending too much on river restoration, or where's all this money going? Why aren't we monitoring it enough? Tell them to go jump in a lake. Where is river restoration practiced? Well, it's practiced in 4 states principally. Washington, Oregon, California, and Maryland make up 88% of total river restoration projects in this country. That needs to change. There's no reason why they should get all the money, right? We need to be darker red in the middle there. And the Great Lakes has helped a little bit. We've got some money coming in. We don't have mitigation like they do in North Carolina, where they allow horrendous impacts to rivers in the first place. But I think that we can change this. So this is data from Bernhardt's paper about where they took 37,000 river restoration projects, and Inter-Fluve, I think, has a few in there, and looked at where stuff was happening and how much it costs. The most commonly stated goals or drivers in this NERS database are enhancing water quality, managing riparian zones, right, Mimi? Improving, she just had a workshop today about that. Improving in-stream habitat, fish passage, and bank stabilization. Now, I think that, in 2005, that was in order, I think, but I think you probably want to move fish passage up more to the top now. How long do projects take? Well, some of you have done these know that how much it takes. I would say bank stabilization. This is looking at Inter-Fluve data. Maybe 6 to 9 months with permitting. Stream restoration projects, that's a very general term, obviously, but 1.5 to 3 years on average with permitting. Dam removal, 3 to 7 years. I have some that are 10 years old and still not going in the ground anytime soon. They just take so long. It's getting better, but the best way to handcuff people, your own agency folks, and others is to have grant programs that require 1 or 2 years for stuff to get done. You can see where the disconnect is here. And so we have to either phase projects in, do them in phases, or try to figure out a better kind of grant system. Because almost every project I work on, and I'm sure all of the projects you work on too, are grant funded. So, I looked at, we got a lot of projects, like, 1,600 some projects, and a lot of those are old and don't have any data associated with them. Plus, I'd have to calculate the inflation, and that's too much math. So I just took the last couple of years worth and looked at the construction budgets and the design budgets on these. And obviously there's no graph here or anything. Marty, Rye, are you here, Marty, yet? Is Marty here? Hey, Marty. Marty used to always like to say, when people ask how much does a river restoration cost, he'd say, well, how much does a house cost? And I love that, because you can't really put a number on it per foot, right? Stream relocation could be anywhere from 50 to 500. It depends on the area and the volume that you're working on, of course, and what you're doing. Same with the other ones. So there's a pretty wide range, as you can see. I guess that's my point. The average design contract, though, at least for Inter-Fluve, has been about $60,000, but it ranged, anywhere from $10,000 up to $400. So again, a big range there. The important thing, I think, to get out of this is that design costs were 20 to 40% of construction costs, and it's particularly important when you're working in urban areas because they come. A lot of the urban folks come preloaded with a 10%. They think that all projects should be 10% of the construction. That's what the design cost should be. And that's true for infrastructure when you're dealing with a lot of standards, or you're building a building or a parking lot. That may be true, but when you have to start from scratch on every project and collect a lot of survey data, do a lot of analysis, it's more of a percentage usually. And there's obviously a cost savings on bigger projects, but so construction costs average $180,000, but that's plus or minus more than 100%. So keep that in mind too. But it gives you an idea. Those numbers jive not too badly with what the nurse people found. They had 20,000 projects associated with associated funding data, look where they're spending the money. I like it. They're spending a lot of money on land acquisition, which I think is awesome. But the dam removal number, don't believe that one because it's kind of old, and I talked to some of the folks that provided a lot of the numbers for that number, and they didn't take into account a lot of times agency time, which I think is really important to do, and sometimes not permitting and things like that. So, or overhead. So we have to, I would say you can't take a small dam, I'm talking like a 10-foot dam. It's pretty tough to take a 10-foot dam out for under $150,000 nowadays. But what makes up a successful state river restoration program? So I went around and called all the people I know that run these programs and asked them what it took to have a stable, a really successful state program. And I had a little stem and leaf plot kind of after a while, and what I got was this. So this is from Massachusetts, Maryland, some Minnesota folks in there too, Oregon, Washington, American Rivers, and a couple others. But number one common item was a dedicated management staff with clear goals. I think a lot of people, like Massachusetts, had a program for many years, but they didn't have any clear goals. And their staff were kind of spread out doing other things. And so this is especially important in a state like Iowa, where you're kind of just getting off the ground and getting some money now and wanting to figure out where to spend that money. So adequate funding of the program, obviously that's a big one. Funding of projects. Watershed group initiation is, of course, very important. Technical guidance from the state. I think you're getting that here, and that's great. Enforceable dam safety laws was one that a lot of people pointed out. So if you have inspection tied to ownership, and then if the dam is deemed unsafe, gets a repair or remove order on it, that really jump starts things going. Otherwise, people just sit on these dams forever and do nothing. So, and then qualified designers. I think that should be first, but that was the last one. And then some other things they talked about, and I've been preaching this for years. I think that you need to start at the headwaters and work your way downstream. It doesn't do any good to put lipstick on a pig. So if you have crappy water quality, what's the point in doing anything downstream, right? So it's important to combine what you're doing. Get with the watershed people and the land conservation easement people, etc., and we all be working together on the same goal. You can do work downstream as long as you have a plan for, what's going to happen and how that change in hydrology, if you get what you want upstream, might affect your project area. And think big. Just because they get all the money out east doesn't mean that we can't get that money too and do bigger projects. So start thinking in terms of miles instead of feet. So here we go. How has river restoration changed over time? I went and looked at my abstract today, and I realized that I had written a nice abstract, but I wasn't really following it very well. And so I apologize for that. I'm not going to present like a history of river restoration. I think I would love to do that, and maybe next time I can do that next year. But yeah, but what I will talk about is I'm going to show a bunch of project pictures, and the idea there is not to show off or anything, but it's to spark a conversation about how those projects might have been done differently 20 years ago, or were done differently. So, so as you know, we're in a pretty new science. Even though Leonardo got things started, things sort of languished for a while. And then until we really screwed things up badly and then realized that we had a problem. And so a lot of the published literature on river restoration was kind of hidden in hydrologic journal articles because there really wasn't a term called river restoration. And then soon after the salmon were listed on the West Coast, there was a big insurgence of river restoration articles. I have not written any of those. A lot, I have a whole slide. Yeah. So early in my career, no, I'm just kidding. When I was working with Marty, we used to, I've got a whole slide presentation with these kinds of pictures in them. It's pretty funny, actually. You wouldn't believe it. Sometimes you're walking along and you see this stuff, but rational economic decision making involves, people doing kind of what they need to do to get what they need done, and not much more than that, and considering the things that they know. And so back when these projects were built, the rational decision-making process did not include the environment. it included getting the bank stabilized for as little money as possible. So somebody had concrete tubes laying around, or tires or cars or whatever, and used those. And so as our sphere of influence or knowledge got better about geomorphology and engineering, there was a period there where gas was cheap and infrastructure was cheap to build, and after World War II, cities expanded and we needed to get water through them quicker. And so this is kind of what was built. And the problem with this stuff is that concrete has a design life of 40 some years and starts to fall apart. And that's what these channels are doing now. And thankfully, like in Milwaukee, for instance, they've started tearing out a lot of this stuff and replacing it with some facsimile of a natural channel. Obviously, you're limited there. And Los Angeles has kind of taken that lesson and is starting to think about doing that too. So it's all good. And I think it's really important to restore these urban corridors because they get people down to the water. You know, they had that slide about, cities before. And yeah, the water quality may be poor and you're not going to catch trout in downtown Des Moines, but it's important to get people down to the river and interact with it, because then they start to think about water quality more. Whereas they drive across it every day and don't even know it. Unless your bridge fails or something. But a lot of times these structural approaches are very abrupt. You look at this one and it's just concrete, boom, and then more built environment. And the abruptness of those transitions is often the problem. So, and also people trying to apply things like gabion baskets, which were really invented to stabilize mountain slopes in Italy. They don't work very well in rivers. Partly because they get eroded around or they fall apart themselves. And Roskin called them time-release sediment capsules, I think is what he calls them. So we've tried, over the years, we've gotten smarter about geomorphology, and I'll talk about some of the fields that go into river restoration and why they're important. But the problem that, as we got kind of in our adolescence with this river restoration, was that people who were biologists or fish biologists thought that they could do these projects and didn't really fully understand the risks. And so if you have good knowledge of biology but a lack of engineering or geomorphology, you get this sort of thing happening. And then if you have a good knowledge of engineering but none of the biological sciences, then you get this sort of thing happening. And so there was always, it still goes on. I was just at a core meeting last week, and it was a really good meeting because there was a hydraulic engineer there, a hydrologist, and a biologist and a planner, and they were just talking past each other, and now we're sort of getting them together, and I think it's good. Another Marty Rye quote: "The size of the riprap is inversely proportional to the information." River restoration possibilities. So these are just some examples of projects. The first thing I want to talk about is this idea of balancing art and science. So there's that myth, it really is a myth about right and left brain, but it works as a metaphor anyway. We need to bring both the right and left together. That's why I was attracted to this field, because I like to draw stuff, and I like to envision the final product and getting there. And so, but you can't just be an artist and do river restoration. You have to have a scientific basis, right? So you might want to play guitar, but you have to have the mathematics behind it to tell you where to put your fingers. Otherwise, it just sounds like garbage. So you can get into a lot of trouble if you don't understand the science part of things. In the old days, bank stabilization, people have been doing it for thousands of years, but when this idea of bioengineering started out, it was a lot of times, a hard toe and and then just grading the banks back, and we still do a lot of that, and it works fine. But there's a lot of other stuff you can do, and you know, we're encapsulating soils now to build in steeper areas, or using geocell treatments like this one here. You still get a ecological face there, and you can build in fish habitat to it, as you see at the bottom, but you're still protecting infrastructure. So there's a time for deformable banks, and there's a time for static banks. And so if you're in urban areas, you're oftentimes constrained, and you have to create a situation that's not deformable. And you can kind of clutch and grab for a few ecological tidbits here and there. Like this kind of stuff, so you're hard armoring the toe, but in this case just to protect monument trees that are in place that are at risk of falling in. People want to protect them. You can build banks to move, but you can control when they move. So I'm going to talk a lot about wood tomorrow, but there are things you can do to, like, you can encapsulate fabrics that hold a buried toe here, for instance. And that fabric underwater will last for 4 or 5 years, gives you time for vegetation to grow. And that's the whole thing about bioengineering, of course. You need roots to hold the soil in place. Wood and other materials can get you a longer period of time. You know, rock obviously is a static thing until your project blows around it, but wood can get you maybe 10, 20, 30 years or more of toe protection. So it's not, so you're able to build a stream that's eventually going to assume the geomorphic process that you want, but not until you've got vegetation that's appropriate to hold that particular type of bank. Native vegetation is becoming more and more important. You know, it was, in the old days, it was just shoving willow stakes in the ground, and you'd get a monoculture of willows on your bank. But now, you know, we can do a lot more. There's, you know, it was fun to watch these things grow over the years, you know, prairie nurseries, native plant places just popping up, and being able to buy plants. You know, and you go to other states like Massachusetts, where river restoration is kind of in its embryonic stages, and you can't find native plants. I had a project that I said we wanted the potted stock material from within 250 feet of, or not feet, but miles. Sorry, that's really tight. And they couldn't do it. Can you believe that? Bastards. But anyway, so I got out there on the construction site, and all the potted stock came, and I looked at the tags, and they said Bailey Nursery, Minneapolis. You know, that's, I don't know. They must have had a wrong kind of map, but you know, their claim was that no one was providing these plants, and so it's getting better though, and you can get seed, and tons of different seed mixes in states now being developed by DOTs and DNRs, etc. So it's much, much better than it was. At first, you know, we started out with just, like I said, willow stakes, and then we worked on things like tubelings, which were willow stakes that you let grow in kind of a sock, and then the roots would start growing, but they didn't really show much more vigor than just a stake if put in properly. And then my personal gravitation was kind of, or evolution involved going to bare root stock, and then messing around with bare root stock and small potted stock, and then realizing that it seemed like the larger the potted stock you use, the better everything just went. I mean, it was easier to control browse, and the plants survived better. And so now it's a combination of stakes, posts, or potted stock and bare root stock, etc. So we have a lot of different options now. You can plant a bank with 20 different species if you want. And you can think about community succession too on banks, and what you want to be there short term versus what you want to be there eventually. When Inter-Fluve started out, we did a lot of projects for ranchers in Montana, and out of the Bozeman office, and that involved creating fishing habitat, really. You know, we were taking ditched spring creeks and meandering them, or going into places where cattle were now being excluded, and then digging pools and building bars and things like that. And we still do some of that, you know, angling drives some of what you do, but it's really waned, you know, in favor of just pure river restoration, which I think is great. You still get people grumbling about woody debris or catching flies on root wads and stuff like that, but the number of projects we've had to do that involve fishing are really restricted to ranch owners in Colorado and Montana. You can build new valleys. Sometimes we've done remarkable damage to entire valleys, and so you can grade them down, rebuild the valley, and then rebuild a stream on top of that. And headwaters down kind of restoration like this, I get more excited about this than anything, because, you know, a little stream like this, this is in eastern Wisconsin, is a nursery area that provides you know, trout stock for the entire river system downstream. So chock-a-block full of baby fish. Talk about wood tomorrow. It's more of a technical presentation, but just in short, you know, you can do a lot of stuff with wood. You can stabilize banks, you can create habitat, you can move rivers around with it, and you can define channel boundaries with wood and do a lot of neat stuff. And I'll talk about that more tomorrow, so I won't talk about it now. Coarse wood, large wood, so this would be large wood. This would be coarse wood. You can use this sometimes, or rarely if it's appropriate, to help give you extend that toe protection so you can get the time you need to grow vegetation. Here's an old picture, again, willow monoculture. You can see the difference now that we'd have a much different vegetation plan for that project there. Building new channels, you know, I like the cost benefit for these kinds of projects the most. Dam removals get you a lot of bang for your buck, but they're expensive. And when you meander a ditch channel, if the cross section is roughly the same or similar, you're taking a stream that's got a sinuosity of 1, essentially, and doubling that maybe. So you're immediately doubling the available habitat volume and area for whatever's living in there. And then add to that riffles and pools and woody debris and undercut banks and things like that, and now you've really done something positive with that money. And it's really fun to go out. It's frustrating at first when I first was doing this, do like 2 or 3 projects and having to wait for them to get going and get built and then watch them mature. It just took forever. And I was very anxious about it. But the best way to do that is for y'all to get lots and lots of projects going at the same time, and then you can't even catch up and get back out there and take photos and absorb and watch the growth of these projects. That is the most fun, is watching how these sites mature. This is a 3-year-old picture now. You can't even see that place. It's a burgeoning white cedar swamp now. You can add stuff, you know, Trout Unlimited and the Driftless area has been pushing a lot of wildlife stuff like snake hibernaculums and hibernacula and other stuff like that, turtle habitat, and that's all awesome. Raptor perches like this, osprey nests, heron rookeries, all that kind of stuff is great. Icing on the cake, you know. Sometimes you have to move rivers because you're moving a road. Now, when you do these kinds of impacts, you can actually make things better. So if you, in this case, we had a ditch channel, and offers you the opportunity to do a pretty Cadillac version of a river restoration project in a different place. You know, you're shifting it over. In this case, it used to go kind of where the road is now. But so we're doing a lot of that, you know, and I think that has really spread around the country. It's good to see. Urban channels, we talked about that earlier. Just, you know, a lot of times it's about conveyance of water, but within that you can get some semblance of natural systems. So this channel on the bottom is immobile. It can't really move, but it's got some riffles and pools in it at least, so that in between rainfall events you've got residual pools in there, whereas the concrete flat bottom channel, when it's dry or between rainfall events, it's bone dry and there's nothing there. A lot of times channels get in size, so if you get a base level change in the main stream channel, that can work its way up through tributaries too, as a result of maybe channelization or just years and years of ditching, etc. Road crossing impacts, stuff like that. Changes in hydrology can cause channel incision. If the conditions are right and you can address the original impact or driver, you can actually raise those channels back up and give that channel more floodplain access. And it's pretty well documented that rivers with good floodplain access have good biological diversity. No big surprise that there's a correlation there. You can integrate quasi-natural things like riffles, in this case, into infrastructure protection too. So you can kind of disguise, whereas in the old days this might have been just a concrete drop structure or something, you can make it a little bit better. Where flooding is a problem, or where you have an incised channel that you can't fix by raising it up, sometimes you can drop the floodplain elevation. There's lots of different ways of doing this and not causing flooding. One version of it works good in places like Minnesota or the Midwest, where you have judicial ditches, and you can actually kind of excavate a floodplain at a lower elevation and build up some berms that contain the larger flood. The problem with low gradient streams and ditching in the Midwest is that you can't raise the channel bed back up, because then you're going to flood everybody out. Because every road crossing, you know, is set. These deep ditches have been there for decades and decades, and so this is a way of trying to get some restoration out of that. Urban wetland restoration, just another example of kind of cramming what you can in the space provided. And wetland channel reclamation is getting a lot easier to do now. Before, it was tough to get anywhere in a wetland without just draglining things, but now we have much better equipment and can get into places like this and build new channels. Golf courses are an opportunity too to turn what is just a conveyance mechanism into an amenity for that course. And some courses are interested in Audubon certification, and this can really help them get there. And a lot of people are clamoring for this kind of thing in golf courses now, you know, native prairie. They go to other places and they see it and they want to have it in there. Fish passage around dams, you know, it used to be concrete structures like you see in the big dams out west, but we can actually build channels that look and function like streams to get fish up there. And the data is pretty good that shows that natural or more natural channels are better for a wider variety of species. Aquatic organism passage, stream or stream simulations, a couple of methods for designing stream crossings that are at least quasi-natural. Usually involves a bottomless culvert or a natural bottom culvert that might be filled. Spreading like wildfire too. Dam removal, of course, you know, we have 75,000 small dams in this country, and they're getting older every day, and they're starting to fall apart, and so there's no shortage of these projects. So I think Wisconsin Dam Removal Fund is around $100,000, which is of course enough to do an engineering study on a dam, but not enough to take any dams out. So we need to get a little bit better funding in the Midwest, especially in places that aren't connected to the Great Lakes. So bluffs and ravines have been implicated lately by Karen and lots of others in contributing a lot of sediment to Midwestern streams. A lot of work's been done in the lower Minnesota Valley. And there are things you can do with wood and other things to stabilize these bluffs somewhat passively. And ravines as well. Retaining water and also infiltrating it instead of just losing more and more soil. So we're on the tail end here. What I want to talk about now is just, I think that river restoration has changed a lot in that we know a lot more about geomorphology and engineering and how all that stuff comes together and meshes now. And so my challenge to you is to make sure that you have a healthy understanding of all the fields that go into it, because that reduces your risk. Projects are getting bigger and more numerous. So if you look at the graph of river restoration projects, it's going up like this. And the size of those projects are getting bigger and bigger. And so the money, it's different from maybe a small bank stabilization project in the past. Now we're talking about a risk of public safety and infrastructure, certainly, but also a risk of losing the money that was spent on that project. So if your project blows up on you, who's going to pay for that, right? And so some of you I know have seen this slide before, but what I like to call the umbrella of due diligence. So when you do a project, you need to have a pretty healthy understanding of what goes into it. You can go to the left side of the picture, which is kind of eyeballing it, hydraulic intuition I call it, and then you're blissfully unaware of the dangers, or you maybe don't care. Or you're willing to accept the risk for a low-cost project. And then the other ones involve a little more analysis, identification of constraints, and working toward an actual design. And those fall under due diligence. The one in the middle may have less data analysis and data collection and information behind it, but maybe you don't need a lot. Due diligence is a graded thing. So it's the amount of due diligence you need for a project needs to be appropriate for the size of that project and the risks involved. So building natural systems, a high level of proficiency can result in a functioning system right away. May not have all the functions of that system, but it's well on its way. You kind of set it on its trajectory, right? The risk of failure, though, is high from multiple directions, and standards are a good way to reduce that risk. I want to read something to you now. It'll only take a minute or two. But this is my summary. I read this book a long time ago, and I just reread it once in a while. It's called Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse, who's a German philosopher. It's really the story of Buddha, if you haven't read it. And he spends a lot of the book trying to figure out what he's doing and getting his act together, looking for enlightenment. And in this particular scene, so he's sitting by the river with, he's been apprenticing with this ferryman for a long time and trying to figure out what's going on. And this sort of Yoda-like guy named Vasudeva is telling him to listen to the river, and in the sound of that river, maybe he'll find the answer. Listen better, Vasudeva whispered. Siddhartha made an effort to listen better. The image of his father, his own image, the image of his son merged. Kamala's image also appeared and was dispersed. And the image of his friend and other images, they all merged with each other. Turned all into the river, headed all being the river for the goal, longing, desiring, suffering. And the river's voice sounded full of yearning, full of burning woe, full of unsatisfiable desire. For the goal the river was heading, Siddhartha saw it hurrying, the river which consisted of him and his loved ones and all of the people he had ever seen. All of these waves and waters were hurrying, suffering towards goals, many goals, the waterfall, the lake, the rapids, the sea, And all goals were all reached, and every goal was followed by a new one. And the water turned into vapor and rose into the sky, turned into rain and poured down from the sky, turned into a source, a stream, a river headed forward once again, flowed on once again. But the longing voice had changed. It still resounded, full of suffering, searching, but other voices joined it. Voices of joy and suffering, good and bad voices, laughing and sad ones, 100 voices, 1,000 voices. Siddhartha listened. He was now nothing but a listener, completely concentrated on listening. Completely empty, he felt that he had now finished learning to listen. Often, before he had heard all this, these many voices in the river, today it sounded new. Already he could no longer tell the many voices apart, not the happy ones from the weeping ones, not the ones of the children from those of men. They all belonged together. The lamentation of learning, yearning, and the laughter of the knowledgeable one. The scream of rage and the moaning of the dying ones. Everything was one. Everything was intertwined and connected, entangled 1,000 times. And everything all together, voices, all goals, all yearning, all suffering, all pleasure. All that was good and evil, all of this world was together. All of it together was the flow of events, was the music of life. And when Siddhartha was listening attentively to this river, this song of 1,000 voices, when he neither listened to the suffering nor the laughter, when he did not tie his soul to any particular voice and submerged himself into it, but when he heard them all, perceived the whole, the oneness, then the great song of the 1,000 voices consisted of a single word, which was Om, the perfection. So, thank you very much. I'll take any questions if you have them, I guess.
We don't have an extra microphone to pass around, so when you ask a question, please elevate your voice. Questions from Marty?
Is the bar still open?
Go for it.
How long are you going to be in the car? So you're going to be here the whole time or just a few?
I'll be here tomorrow for sure, and possibly Wednesday morning.
Perfect, thanks.
Yep. Yep.
So Emily Bernhardt and the nurse team put a lot of emphasis on monitoring, assessment, and learning as part of the definition of success
Yep.
for a restoration project. It didn't really show up on your list. I'm wondering how you
Right.
can reconcile this.
Well, it's hard when you do these kinds of talks because there's so much to talk about. And I went and looked at a bunch of those kinds of I have a folder in my computer that's general river restoration papers, like that one. And Ellen Wool's paper and some of these others, development of standards and things like that. And a lot of them pointed out that we don't do a lot of monitoring on projects. And I think that's true for the most part, but I also know of a few projects that I've done that have had extensive monitoring on them. I can't say that the amount of monitoring is improved or substantially increased, at least in the time that I've been doing the stuff, but certainly the question that always comes up is, did it work? Did this project work that you worked on? And I know for a fact that a lot of the projects where we've done headwater stream restoration, those projects work. And in some cases it's easy because you're taking a stream that wasn't there and you're building one and now there's fish in it, okay, so it worked. Or like dam removal, for instance. The goal of that project is to remove the dam and create connectivity. That's a pretty easy one too. I think that Chris Nislow from Forest Service once told me, that it's really easy to design a fish monitoring project or a river restoration project and show no results. And I think it's really true about biological monitoring. You have to be really careful. I don't know. I could talk all day about monitoring, so.
Let me follow up on that.
Yeah.
It seemed like you did a poll of some agencies, and so it seemed like there's a perception that monitoring was not important to those agencies.
Yeah, it didn't show up on the top 8 or whatever that was, top 7, yeah. So, but I don't know. I did a dam removal a couple of years ago that cost about $400,000, and the monitoring effort was about $700,000. So people are doing it, but it's kind of rare, it seems like. Yeah. I mean, you know, there's of course a grade of monitoring too. I mean, I always go out and look at the projects that we've done, take pictures, etc. But I'm not in there electroshocking or looking at bugs on a regular basis or anything like that. So, yeah.
So I have a question. I'm actually originally from the Pacific Northwest, and as you mentioned in your graph, a lot of the money that gets spent out there is a direct result of the listing of the salmon. So they have kind of an issue that they can kind of centralize around, where they get a lot of their funding from. Do you feel that the Midwest has that sort of issue? Would you consider it water quality or stabilization, or just, is there something that might help draw more money for restoration in the Midwest? Suzanne's got it.
I don't know the answer.
Yeah.
You know the answer?
Yeah, go for
I
it.
don't know if this would answer your question, but I know that there's an American Watershed Group that was formed in the past couple of years. And they recently surveyed all the major watersheds that drain through the Mississippi River and done report cards for it. And that was a lot of the major problems in the Mississippi watershed as a whole. And they're trying to, they're trying to activate groups, money in Congress. to eventually
So what's ours?
I haven't looked at the final report card,
Yeah.
but I know that you're.
Yeah.
The hypoxic
The
zone,
hypoxic zone, that
Gulf.
issue, issues.
that's, EPA has mandated all the states to get together, come up with some sort of nutrient reduction programs. Right now, they're basically, a lot of them are in research, so it's at the infant side of it and everything. But I feel that will be
Kind of the motivation
monies
to,
to move out to the watersheds.
yeah.
You know, nobody cares about mussels, it seems like, and we have lots of
It's too bad,
endangered
they're really
mussels.
cool.
I know, and if we can just divert the Mississippi River into one of the Great Lakes, then we'd have lots of money coming in, but that's not going to happen. I hope that what you're saying about the hypoxia situation is, that would be great if we can just start to get, kind of like Chesapeake Bay, they get so much money out there to save the bay. What about the Gulf of Mexico? You know? Yeah. I mean, there isn't anything like that. There's no, there's nothing here that unfortunately really galvanizes everybody and generates money.
Any other questions? Marty?
You know, whenever I come to these conferences, I always feel uncomfortable when I'm walking around the room because, you know some people, but you've already talked to them, or they're maybe talking to somebody else, so you feel weird about just going up and standing there, like, oh, wait until that guy's done, So I'm a very approachable person, so just come up and join the conversation or talk to me, whatever.
I like that policy. Good policy. Please join me once more in thanking